Early counting shows a 13.2% swing to Labor. The government also suffered an 18-point swing to an independent in Gladys Berejiklian's former electorate of Willoughby. Let's bring in our political panel now. Ebony Bennett from the Australian Institute and Dan Wild from the Institute of Public Affairs. Good to see you both. First to you, Ebony. Premier Dominic Perrottet choosing to focus on the swing to the Liberals in Strathfield, but generally a poor result for the government. Is this a protest vote against his handling of the pandemic, do you think?
Certainly, I think it's one of the key issues here across all four electorates that were up for the by-election. But if you look at the big picture, you know, there was three big swings against the coalition and one more or less expected result for Labor in Strathfield. I know in the electorate of Bega, it wasn't just the handling of the pandemic that was a big issue, but health in general. Labor's candidate down there is a doctor, so that was a big issue, but also the Black Summer bushfires, the fact that a lot of support has been promised, but not necessarily getting to people on the ground who need it for things like housing and rebuilding after those Black Summer bushfires. So a huge number of issues there, and this will be a real concern to Prime Minister Scott Morrison. He'll be counting on New South Wales coalition seats to be rock solid at the federal election, and these by-election results, as well as other polling results that the Australia Institute has shown in the seats of North Sydney and Wentworth, show that it's safe Liberal seats that the Prime Minister is going to be having to worry about. So, yeah, not a great result overall for the coalition.
Dan, do you agree with Ebony and what we said in the intro as well, that there is this result raising concerns for the coalition about the prospects of an impending federal election?
I think so. From a federal level, this would be very concerning. I suspect a significant portion of people's motivation for their votes was local and state issues, but I think there's also a federal issue here. And it's unclear to many voters what it is that the coalition really stands for at the moment in terms of public policy and also in terms of its vision for the future. If we look at the big policy issues that are going to be presented to the Australian people at the upcoming election, there's the issue of net zero emissions by 2050. Well, the coalition has signed on to that, despite the fact that it was Labor policy in the lead up to 2019. On the economic side of things, they've run up to $1 trillion in debt at the Commonwealth level alone, without really a plan to pay it back, which is an issue given the impending increases to interest rates. And we've also got the issue of religious freedom and the inability of the coalition government to deliver any discernible policy outcome for Australians of faith. So I think there's a big issue here for voters about what is the vision that the coalition is offering. At the state level, I just want to make one observation. If we compare and contrast the seat of Willoughby to the seat of Strathfield, I think this shows something interesting for state and federal implications. The Willoughby seat is relatively high income, high education, a fairly socially progressive, socially to the left. Strathfield is more of a traditional sort of middle Australia seat, if you like, and the coalition has performed much better in Strathfield, much worse in Willoughby. And this reflects a growing political and cultural realignment where sort of working class, middle class Australians are moving to the right, and those more affluent seats are looking for more socially progressive representatives. And that's, I suspect, where the shift is going to continue at the federal election.
Ebony, we heard Dan mention religious freedoms. We saw leading up to the election Dominic Perrottet trying to distance himself from Scott Morrison's religious discrimination bill. Do you think this played a factor?
Yeah, look, it's hard to say. The Premier is a devout Catholic, so I actually thought his intervention there was really interesting because to me there's only two reasons why he would have said something. One is that he thinks it was electorally damaging and therefore needed to distance himself from it, or because he thought it was damaging to the community. And I think that really typifies the response that we've seen to that bill this week, where it was shown to be a bill that was a solution in search of a problem. It ended up being more of a sword for religious groups to use to discriminate against others instead of a shield to protect people of faith from discrimination. And I don't think you could kind of get a better analysis than we saw on Insiders this morning from Peter Harcher, where he described the whole thing more or less as just showing the political incompetence of the Prime Minister, who can't control the Parliament, can't control his party, can't deliver on his election promises, and is willing to throw trans kids under the bus, more or less, for vote. So an extremely unedifying week and a very unsuccessful one for the Prime Minister, certainly.
Dan, do you think Scott Morrison was right to shelve the religious discrimination bill following the amendments and 5 Liberals crossing the floor?
I don't really think he had much of a choice from a practical perspective. As Ebony mentioned, he essentially lost control of his party and lost control of the debate. So I'm not sure there was any other outcome that would have been realistic in a political context. I do want to just discuss one component of this religious freedom issue, which is the growing concerns that Australians of faith have as to whether Australia is still a tolerant society. You know, one of Australia's great strengths, and this goes all the way back to when the First Fleet came, not only did the First Fleet bring with it the ideas of freedom of democracy, it also brought with it the sectarian conflict from the British Isles, with the Protestants and Catholic conflict imported to Australia, sometimes having violent repercussions, for example, in the early 1800s at Castle Hill. But the Australian story is really one of overcoming those sectarian conflicts, becoming a more tolerant society, for example, with the Church Act in 1836 that provided for equal funding of Catholic and Protestants and later those of the Jewish faith, was really a landmark achievement in Australia's national story. And that spirit of tolerance is what has been the glue of our society. Millions of migrants have come here, in many cases, to flee intolerant societies, to flee sectarian conflict. And now what they're increasingly finding is this aggressive form of secularism that is very intolerant towards Australians of faith and Christians in particular. So there is this very deep cultural and historical undercurrent that helps explain why the politics of this is so tricky and why I doubt that these very deep issues can be resolved in Parliament.
Well, Ebony, the religious discrimination bill was an election promise. So was a federal independent commission against corruption. Now that that's not going to happen either before the election, do election promises still matter to voters ahead of this election?
Well, I think you can probably normally get away with a broken promise or two if everything else is going really well. And I think there's probably some leeway from the electorate given the pandemic for these types of things. But everything else isn't going well. Things are a bit of a shambles at the moment and the Prime Minister is down in the polls. So I think being seen to not be able to deliver on religious discrimination as well as a federal ICAC, which is much more popular with the electorate, and there is a real need for it. There's a huge gap in Australia's federal integrity system. And for 3 years, the government has been promising but hasn't delivered anything to fix that. We've seen blatant misuse of public money when it comes to things like grants with ministerial discretion being handed out on a partisan basis instead of in the public interest. And the actual model that the government has on the table is one that Australia Institute Research, in particular our National Integrity Committee of ex-judges, has said is deeply, deeply flawed. It protects the public sector, in particular ministers and their staff, in kind of a separate scheme that doesn't even have public hearings. It's got an incredibly high threshold for even starting investigations, and it can't take complaints from whistleblowers. So even if this bill were to have made it to Parliament, I still think it probably would have been deeply flawed and subject to huge debate to deliver something that the public would have faith in. Because ultimately, if the public doesn't have trust in government and in the public sector, that's really bad for Australia's democracy in the long run. And certainly, I think we've seen the consequences of that in Canberra this week, with the convoy, who clearly has deep distrust in the government at all levels, really causing huge problems in the capital this week.
Dan, do you agree? Do you think it would have been better for the government to try to pass a federal ICAC instead of the religious discrimination bill now that we're running out of time? Would have that led to more support at the upcoming election?
No, I have a different perspective. A federal ICAC would be deeply undemocratic and illiberal. And we've seen that in New South Wales. 3 premiers in New South Wales have lost their job, not because of a vote of the public, not because of a vote of the party room, which would be the 2 democratic ways of dealing with the issue, but because a group of unelected bureaucrats decided so. So a federal ICAC would be, as I say, deeply undemocratic. Now, I agree that there are very significant concerns around trust and transparency in the community, but you don't deal with those issues by having an unaccountable body, another unaccountable body in our federal politics full of unelected bureaucrats.
Well, some would argue that the ICAC in New South Wales has uncovered some corruption in the past years. Guys, pleasure to talk to you as always. Thanks so much for your time. Dan Wild from the Institute of Public Affairs, Ebony Bennett from the Australia Institute. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for your time again.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
The bottom 20% get nothing. They're really unfair tax cuts.
People want to see much stronger action from the government when it comes to climate change.
It's no coincidence that we have a wages crisis in Australia.
Transitioning to net zero emissions, it doesn't seem like there's much room for gas.